Esther. And if you have anything else on iPad besides notes or Bible that needs to be turned off, and you only have stuff for this class, you need to be engaged and paying attention. Okay, so yesterday, I know a lot of you were doing some other stuff, so that's all right. Yesterday we went over just kind of introducing Esther, and Esther happens a little bit later. Okay, so I could have started with Ezra and Nehemiah because those books happen a little bit historically earlier. But I wanted to talk about Esther next because it kind of goes along with Daniel in the sense that it's the Jews still living in foreign lands in exile. So we talked about yesterday a little bit that Jeremiah and Isaiah prophesied that even though the Jews were going to go into captivity in Babylon, Jeremiah said that that would last 70 years, and then Cyrus, who's named hundreds of years beforehand and is identified by Jeremiah as well, would be used by God to send the people back into the land to rebuild the temple. This happens around 538 or 539 BC. That's 539 years or so before Jesus' time and the time of the New Testament. Okay, now people go back to the land in certain rounds. There's this first round under this guy named Sheshbazzar that's described in Ezra, and then Ezra leads another round into going back into the land and building the temple. And then there's a third round later by this guy, Nehemiah, who will go and help rebuild the city and provide leadership there. While that's going on, those rounds of returning to the land, not all Jews go back to the land. And that's where you get Esther, is there are many Jews who don't return to the land, who remain either in Persia or the provinces of Persia. And it's kind of not the greatest thing in the world that they just stay behind, because they're supposed to want and fulfill God's promises of going back into the land. But they kind of like it there. It's what they've grown up with, and it's what they are used to. Okay, and so they don't worship other gods anymore. Idolatry for the Jews is pretty much done after the Babylonian captivity, so God's discipline did kind of get rid of idolatry for them, but worldliness becomes the problem from this period forward to the end of the Old Testament. They worship the one true God, but they mix in worldliness, which is going to be the problem in Ezra and Nehemiah. It's going to be confronted by Zechariah, Haggai, and Malachi, that the people are not being faithful to God, faithful to God's priorities and laws, and therefore, they're still under God's judgment. So then we talked about some things to understand in Esther, just by way of review. God's not mentioned in the book, but that's on purpose. It's a device to draw attention to something that isn't there, but should be, because of all the details of the book point to that. So that's what's called conspicuous absence. It's you could probably ask Mr. Collins about this. This is like a literary device of irony that's supposed to, by the thing missing, you draw attention to the fact that it's missing. That's kind of the point. And so then also in the book, Esther is kind of funny, and we're going to see all these ideas converge in the middle of the book. But Esther emphasizes coincidence, chance, luck, fortune. We'll even see that there's the bad guy in the book is even making decisions based on the rolling of dice or the casting of the lot, which is kind of random. But behind those things, you see that God is guiding and working in those things. That's what we're talking about when we talk about God's providence, that he's working not in a direct way, but in an indirect way through the actions and decisions of people that sometimes even just appear to be chance, like that, oh, well, that's a weird coincidence. The other thing that's going to be big in the book is turning things around or reversal. Things are going one direction, and then they're all of a sudden changed to go totally the opposite, which is also going to be kind of funny because of the fact that the kings in Daniel and Esther, they will make this decree, which they say it can't be changed, and then it gets turned around. Okay, so that's kind of funny. The king in the book, Xerxes or Ahasuerus, is a drunk. He's always drinking. Okay, so keep that in mind, because there will become a key moment. This is one of his tells. If you're watching a movie, he'd always be drinking. There's going to be a point in the book where he sets down the cup. And that's going to be kind of a, ominous thing or an important moment in the story. And then also this kind of funny aspect of the book is the presence of these eunuchs, these kind of palace guards who are have had their bodies mutilated so that they cannot reproduce, and so they are men that would be safe to guard the women of the court, who would be the multiple wives of the king. Okay, whenever the eunuchs show up, it's bad for the Gentile people in the book, but good for the Jews. And there's going to be this moment where they seem like they come out of nowhere. Okay, so there's like, it all of a sudden says, and then they did this, and then it mentions the eunuchs, and it's like, where did they come from? And what I kind of compare this to is the Oompa Loompas in Willy Wonka, that there's this, whenever the kids do something bad, that they show up and like sing a song about it. That's kind of what the eunuchs are like, is once they come into the story, you can kind of bet on what's going to happen next, depending on who's there with them. And so we saw yesterday, we looked at Esther chapter 1 a little bit. King Ahasuerus has this awesome kingdom. He has all this wealth. He invites all the governors and people of his provinces to Susa, which is Persia, modern day Iran, or Shoshana. And that city is still there. It's not quite the same, but anyway, it's still present. And he throws this 180-day feast to kind of display all of his wealth, splendor of his kingdom. And it is this amazing kingdom. And so what we see is what Daniel said is coming true. You had the Babylonian kingdom, and now we've moved to the Persian kingdom. Okay, in Daniel's vision, the chest of silver, or the bear in Daniel 7:5. And so, yeah, this kingdom is really great. He throws this 100, and you guys know 180 days is like 6 months, right? Okay, we have 180 school days in a year, right? So if there are 365 days in a year, think 180 of that. And then after the 180-day feast, he has a 7-day feast to concentrated on that. So 187 days total of this party. Displaying his kingdom, and his wife Vashti throws a feast. But Ahasuerus is drinking as usual, and he asks his wife to come and display her beauty in her royal crown in Esther 1:11, and she says no. And this is seen as like a big thing of embarrassment, shame for him. And in a drunken rage, he says, okay, then get her out of here. The next day they decree that she's gone. I'm going to make an irrevocable decree that she is no longer the queen, and I'm going to replace her with somebody better. And it's actually kind of funny in Esther 1 and 2 is the men kind of get concerned. They're like, if the queen can act like this toward her husband, maybe all the women in Persia will act like this. And so they say, you need to make a stand, Ahasuerus, and stand up to this. Well, do you guys, some of you guys who were here yesterday, do you guys remember what, we'll put this, delicately, but in her royal crown, what he was asking for? Because it's like, okay, he just wanted her to show up to the party wearing her crown. But the emphasis of the Hebrew is actually a more subtle way of what he was getting at. Does anybody remember what the point of this was? He was actually asking her to show up. What? Yeah. Just with her royal crown, wearing nothing else. So that's what is the idea here. So that's why she said no, and he, gets of course, upset about that. So we see it's kind of interesting. While he rules the world, the known world at this time, his marriage, he doesn't have control in that area, right? So it's like sin affects that aspect of his life. He's still under the curse and still not able to overcome the curse that's part of sin. And so, anyway, then we looked at a little bit of chapter 2. This is when Esther is coronated. So we get introduced to Esther here. Okay, a couple of things that we need to look at relative to Esther. One of the things that you guys should realize as you read Esther is that there's years that happen between some of the chapters. In Esther 1, that's in the 3rd year of Ahasuerus. It says this in 1:3. In Esther 2, when Esther marries the king, that is in the 7th year of Ahasuerus. So there's 3 or 4 years that have gone on in between him getting rid of Vashti. He goes to war with the Greeks, fails to kind of have a military victory in that campaign, comes back, and then kind of remembers, oh yeah, I got rid of my wife. What am I going to do now? And so during this time is going on. And then in chapter 3, that's in the 12th year of Ahasuerus. So there's multiple years of time going on, even though the chapters, they look back to back, but it actually does say that they are transpiring over time. Okay, so the king now wants to gather. It's suggested to him to gather the young eligible women of Persia and let them kind of compete, and he will choose his next queen, his next wife, and then she would join his probably multiple wives, his harem. In Esther 2:2, it says, "Then the king's attendants who served him said, 'Let beautiful young virgins be sought for the king. Let the king appoint overseers.'" And they're basically going to bring the women in, train them in the ways and customs of the Persians, give them cosmetics to beautify themselves. So this is going to take about a year of time, okay, of preparation. And this is where we get introduced to the main characters. Can somebody read Esther 2:5-7? Esther 2:5-7. Sure, Zach, thank you.
Now there was at the citadel in Susa a Jew whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jar, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, Benjamin, who had been taken into exile from Jerusalem with the captives who had been exiled with Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, had exiled. He was bringing up Hadassah, that is Esther, his uncle's daughter, for she had no father or mother. Now the young lady was beautiful of form and face, and when her father and her mother died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. So we get Esther and Mordecai. And the important thing to understand about Mordecai throughout the book, it calls him most of the time Mordecai the Jew, but he is of the tribe of Benjamin, of the family of Kish, which was the family that Saul was from, Saul and David. Okay, that's going to be important. So Mordecai and Esther are related to Saul. Keep that in mind, tuck that away for chapter 3, okay? Because this is going to be a pivotal aspect of the story. Not only that they're Jews, but they're of this certain family line, okay? And then we get introduced to the main character, right? Esther, but her name, Hebrew name, is not Esther. Did anybody catch in 2:7? What's her actual name? Yeah. Hadassah. You never hear this again. She's called Ishtar, Esther. She's named after a Persian pagan deity. So is Mordecai. He's named after Marduk. Basically, she's called Hadassah, which is named after a certain type of myrtle tree, which is a kind of a shrub. But also, it was named, those myrtle trees show up in biblical prophecy to show the hope of the future. But she doesn't get called this very often. So this would be kind of a fun trivia question. You could go home and ask your parents or somebody, do you know what Esther's actual Hebrew name was? So anyway, that's going to be kind of important because in Daniel, most of the time the author calls them Daniel, calls them by their Hebrew names. Sometimes they'll call them, by their Babylonian names if a Babylonian is speaking to them. But in Esther, she's just called Esther. Mordecai is called Mordecai throughout the book. And Mordecai, we read, he's older. He remembers when the exile took place under Nebuchadnezzar, that God gave over the bad king Jeconiah into the hand of Nebuchadnezzar and put a curse on Jeconiah's house in Jeremiah 22. Okay, so Mordecai's seen kind of the exile unfold for a number of years. And he remains in Persia. He works for the government, and he's raising his younger cousin, kind of a niece. He raises her as his daughter. And then he suggests that Esther participate in joining the king's harem. Now, it was required. A lot of people, women didn't have a lot of choice in doing this, but Mordecai tells Esther to go join the king's harem, to compete to become his wife, his queen. And so Esther goes and does this, but he tells her to hide her Jewish identity. He says, okay, don't let them know you're a Jew. Just go and join this. So we get a little bit of, in this book, kind of what's called some moral ambiguity, where with Daniel, it's very clear. Daniel and his friends, great examples, make a very clear stand for God. Esther and Mordecai, great examples of courage, bravery, acting at a pivotal moment, being used by God. But you wouldn't necessarily want to follow every aspect of their life. They're not as forthcoming about who they are, who their God is, and stuff like this. But that will be important later. God will still use that at that key moment. Okay, so. Anyway, so Esther goes and takes place in this, finds favor among the eunuchs, and they give her suggestions of what would be pleasing to the king. And so the women would go in to the king's palace. He had to bring them in by request, and if he liked them, he would choose them. Okay, so now look at Esther 2:17. It says, this is the conclusion here. It says, the king loved Esther more than all the women, and she found favor and kindness with him more than all the virgins, so that he set a royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. So there's this celebration. And then in 2:20 it says, Esther had not made known her kindred or her people, even as Mordecai had commanded her, for Esther did what Mordecai told her as she had been under his care. Another thing that is kind of hard to reconcile here is that Jews, are they supposed to marry unconverted people who are pagans, people who have not converted to Judaism and worship the one true God? Are they supposed to marry those people? No. Deuteronomy 7:3, do not intermarry with the people of the land. But Esther does this. It's used by God, and she, not like she had, there's not like she just gets to choose or not choose. There's a requirement, but you can kind of see that it's that, like with Daniel and his friends, they said, hey, if we can't obey God, we'll even die rather than disobey God. But we don't see that as clearly with Mordecai and Esther. But God still works in the midst of these circumstances. Okay, so Mordecai, working kind of for the palace and these different things, in chapter 1, there's an important thing that's going to come up later, is that Mordecai saves the king. Okay, this is in 221 and following verses. Okay, so he saves the king. He overhears these two eunuchs talking about trying to assassinate the king. Mordecai hears it, tells Esther. Esther tells the king the plot's foiled, and these guys are killed. They're actually hung up. Okay, when you hear hung in the Bible or hanged, you should think not with a rope. That's what we think of in the West. But you should think of impalement. Okay, that's what it's talking about. So when it talks about cursed is everyone who hangs on a tree, that's what it's talking about. It's like Jesus dying on the cross is being pierced, not being hung with a rope. Or Judas went out and hung himself. And then it talks about an axe that his guts spilled out on the field. Well, some people are like, see, it's a contradiction. It's like, no, if you understand he hung himself on a pike or a spear, then you understand why those things are easily, reconciled. So that's going to become important because hanging will be used in the books. This is what the bad guy Haman will try to hang, impale Mordecai. Okay. Okay. So now let's get into chapter 3. Okay. So. Mordecai does this, the king's grateful, but he doesn't remember to do anything to say thank you. Okay, so that's going to be used in chapter 3. Chapter 3 happens, Esther and the king have been married for a few years. Been married for about 5 years by this point. Okay, so time has moved on. And in chapter 3, we're introduced to the bad guy, Haman, with Haman's plot that he comes up with in chapter 3. Okay, and so Haman put here this word bad guy. And we use the word guy all the time. I use it frequently. Did you guys know that in our English is actually borrowed? It's a word borrowed from Hebrew. Did you know that? So we have a few words in English that are actually borrowed from Hebrew. The word guy in English traces back to New York, and it was used by New York Jews. And when Jews talk about Gentiles, the Hebrew word for the nations or the Gentiles is the goyim, that's the plural, or the goy, G-O-Y in English, and it's pronounced as guy. So when you say Haman's a bad guy, it's like he's, that's actually appropriate. Okay, so Haman is a kind of undersecretary leader that under the king, and is one of his servants, and he gets enraged at Mordecai because he goes out and he's kind of part of the royal court and all this stuff. Do you guys remember the story of Esther? Why does Haman get enraged at Mordecai? You guys remember? You guys know the story of Esther a little bit? Summer, what do you think?
Because he wouldn't bow down.
He wouldn't bow down to him, yeah. And this could be because he worships only God, but I think it's actually better to understand that Mordecai is a Jew, and when you understand Haman, where he's come from, and his family line, that's going to be important for this as well. So Haman gets enraged that Mordecai will not bow down to him, will not pay homage like everybody else, and others are like saying, "Why aren't you obeying the king's command to bow down to this guy?" And he says, Mordecai would tell them, it's because he's a Jew in 3:4. And so Haman is wanting to kill Mordecai, but then he finds out who Haman really is and realizes that they have some history together. Okay, can somebody read Esther 3:1? Melissa, thank you.
After these events, King Ahasuerus promoted Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, and advanced him and established his authority over all the princes who were with him.
Okay, so now we need to understand who Haman is and where he comes from. Haman is an Agagite. Okay, Agagite. He is from a family nation lineage of this people known as the Amalekites. Okay, and he is a descendant of Agag. Okay, a couple things to know is the Amalekites are an enemy of Israel from the very beginning. When Israel goes out in the Exodus, along the way, there are Amalekites that attack them. Okay, and so God says in Exodus 17 and then later in Deuteronomy 25, these will be lifelong enemies, never have their peace, never seek peace with them. Do not let them rest. You need to exterminate them from the land. Okay, that's not taking down to individuals. It's talking about the people in general who stand against God and His people. Okay, so they attacked Israel in Exodus 17. God says, never let them rest until you've exterminated all of them from the land. Now, Israel doesn't fully do that, right? Because Haman and others are still around today. Okay? So, this goes with, I'll just put a few verses here, Exodus 17, Deuteronomy 25. But it actually gets more personal. This is kind of a stretch. It's going back to Old Testament Survey 1. But does anybody remember who Agag was? He's an Amalekite. He's around in 1 Samuel 15. Does anybody remember who Agag was? Or let me put it this way. Agag was a king of the Amalekites who was supposed to be killed by one of Israel's kings. Does anybody remember who was supposed to kill Agag but failed to do it? So Samuel actually kills this guy, but his descendants lived on. Yeah? Saul. Okay, now we see the drama here of what's going on. Haman is a descendant of Agag, who was supposed to be killed by Saul in 1 Samuel 15. Because Saul doesn't kill this guy, Samuel does, his family continues to live on. Okay, and now the Jews are in exile, and Haman wants Mordecai especially to bow down to him to say, my side, my family, the Amalekites, won, and you lost. Okay, also in just Numbers 24, it talks about that the Messiah would come and have victory over Agag. So it looks like that Haman's saying, look, you're going to bow down to me to show that your God lost, your family lost, you're of the family of Saul, I'm of the family of Agag, I have triumphed over you, and now you'll bow down to me. So Haman's mad just in general that Mordecai doesn't bow down to him, but he gets extra mad once he realizes why and what family he's from. And Mordecai says he's a Jew, but he's also a Benjamite. He's also of the family of Kish and the family of Saul. And so now there's this really personal aspect to this conflict. So Haman says, I don't just want to kill Mordecai, I want to kill all the Jews. Just like the Jews were told to kill all the Amalekites, I want to exterminate, kill all the Jews in Persia. Okay? And so Haman is this guy who is, like the ancient Near East, they made a lot of decisions based on lot or casting the dice. Right? So we even see that in the Bible sometimes. So this is going to be important later on in the story. But can somebody read Esther 3:7? Esther 3:7. Summer? Yeah, thank you.
In the first month, which is the month Nisan, in the 12th year of King Ahasuerus, pure, that is the law, is cast before Haman from day to day, every month to month until the 12th month. That is the month Adar.
Okay, thank you. So Haman is kind of gambling, throwing these dice, and there's this word for kind of the lot or dice, which is this word pur. Okay, that's going to be important later because the holiday that comes from Esther is called Purim, which means like plural version of dice. Okay, so he's casting this lot, and it's by doing this that he decides this is the day that I will try to get a decree that all the Persians and everybody living in the provinces can kill all the Jews and take their property. Okay, and that, so there will be this extermination empire-wide of all the Jews. But this is where we see in Esther also this element of chance, luck, fortune, which we know actually isn't the case because in Proverbs 16:33 it says that while things appear random, and sometimes we use chance or something to help us establish a choice, like for example, if you're like, I don't know if I want this or this, let me flip a coin, and that helps you make a choice, right? You didn't have any control over the coin flip, but you said, oh, this will help me establish a preference, okay? And so Proverbs 16:33 says that it talks about God's sovereignty through that whole chapter, but it says the lot is cast into the lap, meaning you throw the dice, but it's every turning up is from the Lord, meaning God ultimately still directs even things to us that we don't control or seem random or luck or things like that. So Haman casts the dice and he decides that, okay, I'm going to choose this date called Adar is the name of the month. 13 is going to be the month that all the Jews get killed. So he goes to Ahasuerus and he tells them, listen to Esther 3:8. He says, Then Haman said to King Ahasuerus, There is a certain people scattered and dispersed among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdoms. Their laws are different from the laws of other people. They do not observe the king's laws. So it is not in the king's interest to let them remain. If it is pleasing to the king, let it be decreed, make a royal decree that can't be changed, that they be destroyed, and I will pay 10,000 talents of silver into the hands of those who carry on the king's business to put in the king's treasuries. Then the king, in verse 10, took off his signet ring and gave it to Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the enemy of the Jews. Okay, and so Haman chooses the date. He has the king's ring. He's able to make the decree. And once a decree is made, according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, you can't change it, even as the king. So now, the king has now set a date, and the king is, notice how this chapter ends. All this news of the decree goes out to every province, and they say, on this coming date, in a matter of months, all the Jews are going to get killed. Everybody can participate in this, and everybody can take their property as spoil. And so, of course, people are confused. The Jews are in mourning and prayer and fasting during this time. And then as this goes out, but listen to 3:15, how the chapter ends. It says, the couriers went out and impelled the king's command while the decree was issued in the citadel of Susa. While the king and Haman sat down to drink, king's always drinking, the city of Susa was in confusion. So they're like, whoa, this is kind of a crazy thing. We're going to have a genocide of these people. All of a sudden, the Jews are, of course, fearful and afraid, and that this is going to take place. And it's an irrevocable decree. The king cannot change this, and he sits down and drinks with Haman while everybody else is in chaos. Okay, so then in and then let me just read Esther 3:13. It says, Letters were sent to the couriers to the king's provinces to destroy, to kill, and annihilate all the Jews. Okay, so this is what is going to take place. Okay, chapter 4. This is when Mordecai tells Esther about that this has gone out and what's going on. This is where we get probably one of the most famous statements from Esther. And this is where you'd expect, again, God to be mentioned, but he isn't. And that's on purpose because it actually draws attention to him by not mentioning him in this context. So Mordecai hears about this in chapter 4. He starts to mourn. He puts on sackcloth, ashes, tears his robes, is weeping. And then Esther sends out clothes and stuff to him, sends the eunuch out to him, all this stuff. And then Mordecai tells Esther what has happened and what is going on and what's going to take place, and that she is going to be vulnerable as well. He says to her, look, don't think you're going to escape this because you're the queen. You will be vulnerable just like everybody else. Okay? And so he warns Esther not to keep silent at this time. In 1 Samuel 10:27, Saul is going to be made king. And there are some people saying, this guy sucks. We don't like Saul and all this stuff. And then it says that Saul kept silent. He didn't reply. And so this wording of, if you keep silent, reminds people of, this is kind of the family pattern of not saying something when you should say something. And so Mordecai warns Esther against that. Can somebody read this verse from Esther 4:14? This is the kind of most famous verse from this book. Yeah, Zach, thank you.
For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place, and you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not attained royalty for such a time as this.
Right, so he says to her, look, if you don't say something, relief, salvation is going to come for the Jews from another place. So he's basically implying God will use someone else to bring this about. But he's saying, but God might be using you, might be placing you in a unique position for just this time. So that's what he says. He asks this kind of rhetorical question. Who knows whether you have not attained royalty for such a time as this? The Esther becoming queen and all this stuff has happened a few years ago, and now Mordecai is saying maybe this was why God had those things happen in the first place. Except he doesn't say God in this context, but it's obvious that this is what's taking place. And so Esther tells Mordecai to have all the Jews mourn, fast for her, which would include prayer, and then she's supposed to go into the king. But she's concerned to go into the king and approach him. Why? Why is she concerned to approach the king? Yeah.
It's Persian law. If you're not summoned, you can die.
Yeah, if you're not summoned, you could get executed immediately. And remember, to be fair, there was an assassination plot a few years ago. So if somebody just comes in without being invited, you could die on the spot. Even if you're the queen, it doesn't matter. And Esther even says prior to this, while she's going back and forth with Mordecai, she says, the king hasn't summoned me for 30 days. So she's thinking, maybe he has another woman. He's focusing on someone else in his harem. I don't have any sway with him possibly anymore. So she says here in 4:16, after she says, have all the Jews mourn and fast for me and not eat anything, she says, and thus I will go into the king, which is not according to the law, and if I perish, I perish. Meaning, if I die, that's what's going to happen. So she's resolved to go do that. In chapter 5, so here's where we start getting to the core of the book, is in chapters 5 and 6. This is where God starts turning the things around. Esther plans for the king. In Esther 5, she does go in before the king. he extends the scepter over her, and she touches it, which shows that she is welcomed, even though she hasn't been invited. And then in 5:2, he says, when the king saw Esther, the queen, standing in the court, she obtained favor in his sight, and the king extended to Esther the golden scepter which was in his hand. So Esther came near and touched the top of the scepter. Then the king said, what is troubling Queen Esther, and what is your request? Even to half my kingdom, and it will be given to you. Which is kind of funny, because in the beginning, they were kind of all concerned that, there would be this kind of takeover where Vashti would see herself as equal to the king. And now he's saying, I'll give you half, so that we'll pretty much be equals as far as this goes. And Esther doesn't blurt out, okay, well, this is what's going on. She invites Xerxes, or Ahasuerus, and Haman to a first banquet that next night. Okay, which seems kind of, out of place, but she says, bring Haman, come, we're going to drink. It says that they drank wine, which is his favorite thing. And then she says, I'll tell you what my request is. Okay, and so they go in, and Haman's really excited because he's invited to dine with the king and queen. And so for him, this is like going really well. Okay, but Esther doesn't say anything that night. She actually invites Haman and the king back for banquet number 2 the next night. Okay, so Haman is having an awesome time. Okay, and he then goes on his way home. Look at 5:9. It says, when Haman went out that day, pleased of heart, and when Haman saw Mordecai in the king's gate, did not stand up or tremble before him, still not bowing to him, still not respecting him, still not afraid of him, Haman was filled with anger against Mordecai. Haman controlled himself, however, and went to his house to talk to his friends, his wife, Zeresh. And so he's talking about how awesome his life is right now, but he says, I still can't get over the fact that Mordecai the Jew will not bow down to me. I can't wait to kill him. I can't just wait around for this guy who I hate to die when all the rest of the Jews do. Okay, look at 5:13. He says, the queen has invited me in, the king, I dine with the king and queen. And then 5:13, yet all of this does not satisfy me every time I see Mordecai the Jew sitting in the king's gate. So he says, nothing is good enough for me when this guy is still alive. So his wife suggests, build a gallows, build a pike, and then go to the king, say that you want Mordecai thrown onto it and executed and hung, and that'll be that. Your enemy will die, and your life, you'll get rid of the one thing that's bothering you. And so he thinks, sweet. So he has these eunuchs start to build the gallows. Okay, and so while this is going on that evening, look at chapter 6. The king can't sleep. Okay, the king can't sleep. So when he can't sleep, he wants to have someone read to him something that he can kind of listen to and relax while he goes to sleep. So they're like, okay, we need to bring in something boring. Let's bring in these government documents that are the history of the king's life and what's been going on. Okay, and so the king, for under God's providence, is not able to sleep. They're like, let's read him all these boring documents about the history of his life, which is kind of funny because they're like, well, your life is not that great. Let's read this, and that'll put you right to sleep. But then they read him out of the section that reminds him of Mordecai saving his life and foiling the plot to execute him. Okay. Were you? Okay. I thought you were raising your hand. And then he's laying there in bed, and he goes, wait a second. Read that back, and then he says, did I ever do anything for that guy to thank him? What honor did I show him, or dignity did I bestow on him for saving my life? And they look, and they're like, nothing. You didn't do anything. And so the king is like, okay, who's in the court? I got to do something to thank this guy. Here is where the actual turnaround happens. And I'll just read this and then we'll quit here. But look at, this is the, in a sense, one of the funniest parts of the book. Because you can literally see the sentence that the whole thing turns around. Haman is coming into the court to say, I want to build a gallows to execute Mordecai. The king is getting out of bed to go look for someone to find Haman to honor Mordecai, and there's going to be this switch. Look at 6:5-9. It says, the king's servants said to him, behold, Haman is standing in the court. And the king said, let him come in. Then Haman came into the king and said, and this is what the king says, what honor is to be done for, what is to be done for the man whom the king desires to honor? Who does Haman think the king is talking about? King says, I want to honor somebody, a man, and who does Haman think that is?
Himself.
He thinks that's him. So he says, sweet, the king wants to honor me. Now Haman's going to describe what that should look like, but it's actually going to apply to his enemy, Mordecai. Okay, now look. And Haman said to himself, whom would the king desire to honor more than me? Then Haman said to the king, for the man whom the king desires to honor, let them bring a royal robe which the king has worn, and a horse which the king has ridden on, and let a royal crown be placed on his head. And let the robe and the horse be handed over to one of the king's most noble princes, and let the array of the man whom the king desires to honor, and lead him on horseback through the city square, and proclaim, thus it shall be done to the man whom the king desires to honor. Then the king said to Haman, take quickly the robes and the horse and all that you have said, and do this for Mordecai the Jew. Okay, it's funny because that's the center of the book, 6:5-9. You can even see on that outline that I gave you. That's where the switch takes place, the ultimate reversal. Now everything is going to be kind of reversed from here on out. That Haman, he says, what should I do to honor the man who the king desires to honor? Haman says, do this. And the king says, okay, now do that for Mordecai the Jew, and switches the whole situation so that Haman has to do that for his enemy. So Haman's going to have a really bad day. He had an awesome evening. Now he's going to have a really bad day because he's going to have to celebrate his enemy and lead the way in that. And then he's going to go to banquet number 2, which he thinks is, okay, well, at least I get to go have a nice dinner with the king and queen. But that does not end well for him either. So we'll see that tomorrow. Okay, we got to quit here. Let's go ahead and get packed up to go.